The carbine kicks against Marcus Hewitt's shoulder once, twice, 3 times. Every third round burns white through the darkness like a falling star torn from the sky itself. The muzzle flash, brighter than any rifle he's ever fired, turns the foxhole into a temporary sun. His hands shake, not from fear, from the recoil cycling through cheap government-issue wood and steel that weighs less than 6 pounds loaded. August 1942. Guadalcanal, western perimeter of Henderson Field. The jungle presses in on all sides, close enough that Hewitt can smell rotting vegetation mixing with his own sweat. Temperature dropped 20 degrees after sunset, but the humidity stayed. Now it hangs in the air like an invisible wall, making every breath feel like drowning. The tree line 30 yards out dissolves into absolute black. No moonlight, no stars, just the kind of darkness that makes you doubt your own eyes are open. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy war stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Hewitt crouches lower behind the waterlogged log that serves as his only cover. The M1 Carbine feels wrong in his hands, too light, too small. He's a second lieutenant with 200 Marines stretched along a perimeter that exists more as theory than reality. Behind him, Henderson Field. In front of him, an enemy that owns the night. The noise started 10 minutes ago. Not voices, not movement, just the jungle going quiet in a way that means predators are close. Then came the rustle. A single branch snapping, silence so complete that Hewitt's pulse hammers loud enough to give away his position. Then contact. The Japanese assault formation materializes out of nothing, shadows becoming men, men becoming threats. Hewitt fires without thinking, muscle memory from training taking over where thought would slow him down. The carbine chatters in his grip, spitting those white-hot tracers into the darkness at a rate that feels impossible for a weapon this size. Something happens that he doesn't understand yet. The enemy hesitates, just for a heartbeat. Maybe 2. But in combat, a heartbeat is the difference between overrunning a position and dying in the attempt. The banzai charge that should have crashed through his foxhole and kept going fractures. Men who were running full speed suddenly aren't. The formation that looked unstoppable scatters. Hewitt keeps firing. The magazine runs dry faster than he expects, 15 rounds gone in seconds. His fingers fumble for a fresh magazine, muscle memory guiding the reload in darkness. The new magazine clicks home. He chambers a round, fires again. More white tracers, more muzzle flash, more fire falling through humid air that makes every discharge visible for 100 yards in all directions. 50 yards to his left, another carbine opens up. Same pattern, every third round burning white, then another position, then another. The entire defensive line transforms into something that looks less like infantry fire and more like anti-aircraft guns tilted downward. The Japanese attack collapses, not because of casualties. The carbine's 110-grain bullet doesn't drop men the way the heavier M1 Carbine does, not because of accuracy. In this darkness, aimed fire is mythology. The attack collapses because men don't charge toward walls of visible fire when everything in their training says rifle fire should be invisible. Hewitt doesn't understand what just happened. Nobody on this perimeter understands. They just know it worked. And in war, working is enough. Understanding comes later if you survive long enough to care. The jungle goes quiet again. Different quiet this time, the kind that means the enemy pulled back to regroup, to figure out what went wrong, to decide whether another assault is worth the cost. Hewitt's hands finally stop shaking. He checks his ammunition, 3 magazines left, 2 loaded with the standard every third round tracer mix, 1 loaded entirely with ball ammunition for when he needs to shoot without announcing his position to every enemy within visual range. He doesn't know it yet, but the weapon in his hands, a weapon designed for clerks and radiomen, a weapon that Marines on this same island are trying to trade away for proper rifles, just rewrote Pacific Night combat doctrine. Not through engineering, not through superior firepower, through something simpler and more primal than ballistics tables. Through light, through the way human beings respond when they see fire falling from positions they cannot locate, when darkness offers no protection, when the very thing that should hide them becomes the thing that kills them. The weapon producing this effect was never designed for frontline terror. It was never designed to reshape battlefields. But design intent matters less than battlefield reality. And on Guadalcanal in August 1942, reality is teaching lessons that no military manual predicted. The Pacific Theater doesn't follow European rules. In France, firefights develop at ranges measured in football fields, 200 yards, 300, sometimes 500 if the terrain cooperates. Tank commanders scan horizons that stretch for kilometers. Artillery spotters call corrections from church steeples that let them see the entire battlefield laid out like a map. On Guadalcanal, the jungle compresses everything. Visibility at night drops to 10 meters on a clear night, 15 if moonlight filters through the triple canopy rainforest overhead. Most nights aren't clear. Most nights you can hold your hand 6 inches from your face and see nothing but varying shades of black. Sound behaves strangely here. A twig snapping 2 feet away sounds distant, muffled by humidity and vegetation. A mortar round landing 50 yards out arrives with zero warning except the whistle of descent, then detonation, then screaming. Distance becomes impossible to judge. Direction becomes guesswork. Everything that works in open terrain fails in jungle that hasn't seen sunlight reach the ground in decades. The humidity does more than make men miserable. It transforms the battlefield into something that defies training manuals written for European combat. Moisture hangs in the air like an invisible curtain. Light refracts through it. Muzzle flash that should be a brief flicker becomes a sustained bloom. Tracer rounds that should burn out quickly stay lit longer. They're chemical compounds interacting with atmospheric conditions nobody tested for in Nevada proving grounds. Powder residue clings to rifle barrels, sweat pools in trigger housings, salt from the ocean, just 3 miles away but feeling like another world, corrodes metal overnight. Weapons jam, ammunition fails. The jungle doesn't care about superior American manufacturing. It attacks steel and wood with the patience of something that's been here longer than nations. Temperature creates its own tactical problems. Daytime heat drives Japanese defenders underground into caves and bunkers where they wait out American artillery and airstrikes. The heat makes movement torture. Carrying 60 pounds of equipment through terrain where every step might be your last becomes a test of will more than fitness. Then night falls. Temperature drops 20 degrees in the first hour after sunset. The jungle becomes a different battlefield. What was an oven becomes something almost comfortable. Almost. And in that temperature shift, tactical advantage reverses. The heat that punished attackers during the day now favors them. Darkness that should protect defenders becomes the thing that gets them killed. Range stops mattering entirely. The M1 Carbine, brilliant at 300 yards, capable of dropping an enemy at half a mile with proper marksmanship, becomes a liability in close quarters. 8 pounds of wood and steel designed for open field combat turns into a cumbersome club when the enemy materializes 3 yards away. The point, 30.06 round it fires, carries so much energy that it overpenetrates at close range, passing through one target to wound friendlies behind. This isn't a rifleman's war. This isn't the kind of combat that rewards marksmanship badges and qualification scores. This is a war of volume, of proximity, of who breaks first when the distance between you and the enemy shrinks to knife-fighting range. Deterrent. Doctrine written for European battlefields assumes certain fundamentals, assumes visibility, assumes fields of fire, assumes defenders can see attackers coming in time to establish proper firing solutions. Every one of those assumptions dies in jungle terrain where the only warning you get is the sound of vegetation moving. And by the time you hear that, the enemy is close enough to see the whites of your eyes. Which means the weapons that dominate here won't be the ones with the longest effective range, won't be the ones with the most kinetic energy, won't be the ones that look impressive in training demonstrations. They'll be the ones that break enemy will before physical contact occurs, the ones that create psychological effects disproportionate to their actual lethality, the ones that turn the enemy's tactical advantages against them. They'll be the weapons that make fear visible in the dark. October 1941. The United States Army adopts the M1 Carbine with absolute clarity about its intended role. It is not a battle rifle. It is not designed to replace the M1 Garand. It is not meant for frontline infantry who will face enemy soldiers at typical combat ranges. The mission profile is specific, limited, and completely unambiguous. The M1 Carbine exists to replace pistols. Radiomen hauling 30-pound backpack transceivers need something more effective than a .45 automatic, but lighter than a full-size rifle. Artillery crews servicing howitzers need a weapon they can sling across their backs without interfering with their primary job. Tank crews need something that fits inside cramped fighting compartments. Officers need a weapon that doesn't announce their rank to every enemy sniper within visual range. Military police patrolling rear areas need something between a pistol and a rifle for handling deserters and saboteurs. For these roles, the M1 Carbine makes perfect sense. The .30 carbine cartridge reflects this limited ambition. The bullet weighs 110 grains, half what the M1 Garand's .30.06 round weighs. Muzzle velocity from the carbine's 18-inch barrel, 1,990 feet per second. Muzzle energy, 967 foot-pounds, roughly double what a .45 ACP delivers from a Thompson submachine gun. Roughly one-third what the Garand delivers with its thunderous 2,800 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The weapon itself weighs 5.2 pounds empty. Compact, handy. The 15-round detachable box magazine allows faster reloads than the Garand's 8-round on-block clips that ping when empty and announce to everyone within earshot that you're reloading. The carbine handles beautifully, points naturally. The recoil is manageable even for soldiers with minimal training. The gas-operated action cycles smoothly. The weapon is everything it was designed to be. But every design reflects assumptions about how it will be used. Army testing protocols in 1941 established the carbine's effective range at 300 yards, adequate for its intended role. More than adequate, actually. Rear echelon troops defending supply dumps don't engage targets at 500 yards. They need something better than a pistol at 50 yards, something they can actually hit with, something that won't overpenetrate and damage the supplies they're protecting. The doctrine makes perfect sense in theory. In theory, there are clear lines between front and rear. In theory, support troops stay in support roles. In theory, weapons designed for limited engagement profiles only face threat within those limitations. Theory assumes the enemy cooperates with your organizational charts. Reality has different ideas. In late 1942, Marine and Army units deployed to the Pacific with significant numbers of M1 carbines distributed according to that doctrine. Officers carry them, radiomen carry them, artillery forward observers carry them. Nobody questions this. Nobody needs to question it. The weapon performs exactly as designed. Then those units experience Pacific jungle combat for the first time. Two things become clear immediately. First, there is no rear echelon in the Pacific. The jungle doesn't respect defensive perimeters. Japanese infiltration tactics mean every position is a frontline position. Supply dumps get hit, command posts get overrun, artillery positions become close-quarters battlefields. The clean separation between combat roles and support roles dissolves the first time a radio man has to kill a Japanese soldier at 10 yards while calling in fire missions. Second, the jungle doesn't care about doctrine. Effective range on a Nevada proving ground means nothing when you can't see past 30 yards. Ballistic performance at 300 yards becomes irrelevant when most firefights happen at 15. The weapon designed to keep clerks alive at 50 yards gets tested in night firefights, where the distance from defender to attacker can be measured in seconds of sprint time. Nobody knows if it will pass that test, not Winchester, who manufactured it, not Army Ordnance, who specified it, not the Marines loading magazines on Guadalcanal while wondering if they'll survive their first night in the defensive perimeter. The weapon is about to face trials its designers never imagined, and the results will determine whether 6 million of them get produced, or whether the carbine becomes a footnote in small arms history. Combat cares nothing for design intent. Combat only cares what works. November 1942. The first combat reports from Guadalcanal reach Marine Corps headquarters. They are not encouraging. A corporal from Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines writes a letter home that gets intercepted by military censors and flagged for intelligence review. The language is blunt. The carbine is handy. The carbine is light. The carbine will not stop the enemy. Hit a Japanese soldier twice, center mass, and he keeps coming. The corporal doesn't recommend the weapon. He doesn't trust it. Given a choice, he'd take an M1 Garand and accept the extra weight. Another Marine, a radio man who specifically requested a carbine because he needed more range than his .45 offered, submits a formal complaint through his chain of command. Close range, the carbine works. Past 50 yards, you might as well throw rocks. The bullet arrives. The bullet hits. The bullet passes through without creating the kind of wound channel that drops a man immediately. The problem isn't accuracy. Marines can hit what they aim at. The M1 Carbine shoots where you point it. The sights are good. The trigger is crisp. Marksmanship isn't the issue. The issue is what happens when the bullet arrives. Japanese infantry doctrine in 1942 emphasizes three things above all else: shock, speed, and the bayonet. Soldiers train relentlessly for close-quarters combat. They condition themselves to close distance rapidly and finish engagements with cold steel. The psychological component is deliberate. Japanese commanders understand that men who hesitate die, so they train hesitation out through repetition until charging becomes reflex. But there's another factor, one that American intelligence doesn't fully grasp until late 1942, when captured documents and prisoner interrogations reveal its extent: methamphetamine. Japanese forces distribute the drug to their troops under the brand name Philippon. The drug keeps soldiers awake for days at a time. It suppresses appetite, allowing troops to function on minimal rations during extended operations. Most critically for night combat, it eliminates hesitation. Men under the influence don't process pain the way unimpaired men do. A wound that should drop them, that would drop them in any normal circumstance, produces a momentary flinch, then forward momentum resumes. This creates a nightmare scenario for American defenders. The carbine's 110-grain bullet traveling at 1,990 feet per second creates a wound channel adequate to kill. Eventually, the bullet penetrates, it damages tissue, it creates hydrostatic shock proportional to its energy. In medical terms, the wound is lethal. In tactical terms, lethal means the target dies before reaching your position. But eventually isn't immediate. Eventually might mean 10 seconds, 20 seconds, sometimes a full minute. And in that minute, a Japanese soldier high on methamphetamine and trained to ignore pain can cover 50 yards and drive a bayonet through your chest while you're cycling the bolt or changing magazines. The reports pile up through November and December. Same story, different units. The carbine won't stop them fast enough. The carbine requires multiple hits to achieve immediate incapacitation. The carbine makes Marines feel undergunned compared to Army units with M1 Garines. Confidence erodes rapidly. By December 1942, Marines on Guadalcanal begin acquiring M1 Garines through unofficial channels. Sometimes they trade. Sometimes they just take them from Army units rotating through the same supply points. The acquisition happens quietly, without paperwork, in numbers significant enough that Army commanders start stationing officers at embarkation points specifically to confiscate rifles when Marines rotate off the island. The weapon intended to keep support troops alive becomes something frontline Marines actively avoid. If you carry a carbine, you're announcing to everyone around you that you're either support personnel or you got stuck with inferior equipment. Neither interpretation helps morale. Then something changes, not officially, not through formal doctrine updates or equipment modifications. The change happens at the squad level, in foxholes, during long nights when men have nothing to do but think about how to survive the next bonsai charge. Improvisation begins, quiet, unofficial, completely unauthorized, but in combat, authorization matters less than survival, and Marines facing their third or fourth night defense start experimenting with anything that might shift the odds. To understand why American tracer fire became psychologically devastating to Japanese forces, you need to understand what Japanese commanders expected from night operations. Night attacks aren't romantic in Japanese doctrine. They're calculated tactical advantage. Japanese Army field manuals designate night operations as the preferred offensive method throughout the Pacific Campaign. This isn't cultural preference. This isn't Bushido mysticism. This is cold tactical calculation based on realistic assessment of American material superiority. Night operations neutralize American advantages across the board. Artillery becomes less effective when forward observers can't spot targets or call corrections. Air support vanishes entirely after sunset. Even the M1 Carbine semi-automatic advantage diminishes when you can't see targets beyond arm's reach. At night, superior firepower means less. Superior numbers mean less. What matters is who can move silently and who breaks first when the fighting becomes hand-to-hand. Japanese infantry tactics during night attacks follow a methodical pattern refined through years of combat in China. First phase, infiltration units move forward in small teams, 3 to 5 men per team. Their mission isn't to attack, it's to probe. They identify gaps in American defensive lines. They cut communication wire. They mark defensive positions for follow-on forces. They neutralize isolated machine gun nests when possible. The infiltration teams operate in complete silence. No talking, no unnecessary movement. They navigate by starlight and memorize terrain features. They can move within feet of American positions without being detected. When they encounter resistance, they withdraw rather than engage. Their job is intelligence gathering, not combat. Second phase. The main assault echelon advances in 2 waves. The first wave moves to contact, then rushes forward to seize an initial objective. Usually the forward edge of the American defensive perimeter. The first wave accepts heavy casualties as the cost of gaining that initial foothold. Their job is to create chaos, to force American defenders to reveal their positions, to absorb the initial defensive fire. The second wave passes through the first while defenders are reloading or repositioning. The second wave drives deeper, aiming for high-value targets, artillery positions, command posts, communication centers. The second wave is where success or failure gets determined. The psychological component is deliberate and sophisticated. Japanese commanders understand that darkness amplifies fear. Unknown threats feel larger than visible ones, so they incorporate noise into the assault, shouting, banging equipment, blowing whistles, creating the auditory impression of overwhelming numbers. The reality behind the noise: most night attacks involve company strength units, 200 men, sometimes 300. But in absolute darkness, 200 voices screaming coordinated battle cries sound like 2,000. The psychological multiplication factor is significant. Defenders who think they're facing regiment strength forces behave differently than defenders who understand the actual threat scale. For this doctrine to succeed, Japanese soldiers must believe in its effectiveness. They train for night movement until navigating by starlight becomes second nature. They practice bayonet fighting in complete darkness, learning to sense rather than see their opponents. They accept casualty rates that would be unacceptable in daylight operations. They expect to lose 30%, 40%, sometimes 50% of the assault force. But they also expect to break through. They expect American defenders to crack under pressure. Historical experience from early Pacific campaigns supports this expectation. American units facing their first night attack often panic. Friendly fire casualties increase. Defensive coordination breaks down. Perimeters collapse. They expect muzzle flashes to reveal defensive positions. Standard tactical procedure: when you see a muzzle flash, mark the position and direct fire toward it. In darkness, every shot you take announces your location. The side that shoots first often loses because they've given away their positions to an enemy that hasn't revealed theirs yet. What Japanese doctrine doesn't account for, what no military manual prepared them for, is weapons that turn darkness into daylight, weapons that create visible fire arcing through the air from positions impossible to pinpoint, weapons that make every defensive shot a psychological weapon as much as a kinetic one. American defenders are about to violate every assumption Japanese night fighting doctrine is built on, not through superior tactics, not through better training, through something simpler and more primal. through making fear visible in the dark. The myth dies first. No American troops loaded aircraft ammunition into M1 carbines, not experimentally, not in desperation, not during the worst nights on Guadalcanal when men would have tried anything to survive until dawn. The claim is mechanically impossible, and anyone who understands basic firearms engineering knows why. The point. .30 carbine cartridge measures 7.62 x 33 millimeters. The .30.06 Springfield round fired by aircraft machine guns measures 7.62 x 63 millimeters. Almost twice the case length. You cannot chamber a .30.06 round in an M1 carbine any more than you can chamber a rifle cartridge in a pistol. The bolt won't close, the extractor won't grip, the firing pin won't reach the primer. Physics doesn't bend for desperation. But something real happened, something documented in ordnance records and after-action reports, something that explains every account of fire falling from the sky. August 1943. British forces fighting in Burma submit a formal request to American ordnance departments. They need better visibility for night engagements against Japanese forces using the same infiltration tactics perfected on Guadalcanal. Standard ball ammunition works fine during daylight. At night, soldiers can't see where their rounds are going, can't correct their fire, can't tell if they're hitting anything or just wasting ammunition into darkness. American Ordnance responds with development of a specific .30 carbine cartridge designated M16 Tracer. Production begins that same year. The round uses a 110-grain bullet identical in weight to standard ball ammunition, but embedded in the bullet's base is a pyrotechnic compound. When the powder charge ignites and drives the bullet down the barrel, that compound ignites too. The result: a bright visible trace lasting to approximately 570 yards, far beyond the carbine's effective range of 300 yards. The burn color varies depending on atmospheric conditions: bright white in dry air, reddish-orange in humidity, sometimes both colors alternating as the round travels downrange and atmospheric conditions change. The M16 Tracer reaches Pacific units by late 1943. Distribution happens through normal supply channels, no special authorization required. Tracers are standard ammunition, not experimental rounds. Units receive them mixed with ball ammunition in the same crates. Standard loading practice develops organically at the squad level, every third round a tracer. This creates a visual reference for correcting fire without constantly revealing the shooter's exact position. Some units experiment with every other round loading. A few, particularly those assigned to static night defense positions, load entire magazines with nothing but tracers. The effect exceeds every expectation. The M1 Carbine's short 18-inch barrel and gas-operated action creates substantial muzzle flash under normal conditions. Standard for any rifle, just more visible than longer-barreled weapons. Add tracer rounds and each shot becomes something else entirely. A streak of burning white phosphorus tearing through humid jungle air. The muzzle flash illuminates a 20-foot radius for a fraction of a second, long enough to silhouette targets, long enough to create momentary night blindness in anyone staring directly at it. Field reports from Bougainville in late 1943 note that M1 carbines loaded with tracers produced excellent results during night infiltration attempts. The phrasing is bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. Japanese infiltration teams, previously successful at reaching American positions undetected, now withdraw when they encounter tracer fire. An after-action report from Saipan in June 1944 specifically mentions defensive positions using continuous tracer fire from M1 carbines to break up banzai charges. The report includes casualty figures showing that Japanese forces suffered disproportionate losses during night attacks compared to similar operations on other islands. The rounds were legal. They were intended for exactly this purpose. The mechanism behind what some accounts later described as sky fire, if such descriptions ever existed in Japanese after-action reports, wasn't mystery ammunition or experimental hardware. It was standard-issue tracer doing exactly what ordnance engineers designed it to do. Amplified by environmental conditions nobody tested for in stateside proving grounds. magnified by tactical circumstances nobody anticipated when the M1 Carbine was still just blueprints on a Winchester drawing board. The fire wasn't falling from the sky. It was coming from weapons that weighed less than 6 pounds and fired rounds that cost 3 cents each. But to men attacking through absolute darkness, trained to expect rifle fire to be invisible, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that the night, their tactical advantage, their strategic asset, their reason for accepting 50% casualty rates, had stopped protecting them. The historical record becomes indirect here. No captured Japanese field manual uses terminology equivalent to skyfire when describing American carbine fire. No verified post-war interview with Japanese veterans currently accessible in English-language military archives uses that specific phrase. United States Army historical reports from the Pacific Theater mention Japanese reluctance to conduct night attacks against certain American positions, but they attribute this to volume of fire rather than visual effects. Yet American after-action reports from 1943 onward consistently document something that suggests the phenomenon described was real, even if the exact terminology remains uncertain. A Marine lieutenant named Deshaun Colbert files a report from Bougainville in November 1943. His platoon holds a section of perimeter that gets probed nightly by Japanese infiltration teams. On the 5th night, Colbert authorizes his carbine-equipped squad to load full tracer magazines. His report notes that Japanese attackers stopped mid-charge when carbine fire lit up their position. The attack didn't fail because of casualties. It failed because the assault formation broke cohesion and withdrew. Another account from the 37th Infantry Division on New Georgia describes a night assault in July 1943 that broke apart when defenders used continuous tracer fire to mark targets. The division intelligence officer includes a note that prisoners captured the following day described American night defense as impossible to approach without being seen. An intelligence report from Saipan in July 1944 includes interrogation summaries from captured Japanese soldiers. Multiple prisoners independently describe American defensive fire at night as creating walls of fire. One prisoner uses the phrase "fire from everywhere" when describing his experience attempting to reach American positions during the massive Banzai charge on July 7th. Based on what military historians can reconstruct from these reports, the visual effects of tracer fire created psychological responses that Japanese tactical doctrine hadn't prepared soldiers for. Fire that traced back to its source should have been a tactical advantage for attackers. Every tracer round creates a line pointing directly back to the shooter. Japanese doctrine trained soldiers to mark muzzle flashes and direct counterfire toward them. In theory, tracers should have made American positions easier to target. But the carbine's short barrel changed the equation. Tracer ignition occurred almost at the muzzle. By the time the burning phosphorus became fully visible to attackers downrange, the round had already traveled 15 to 20 yards from the shooter's position. What attackers saw wasn't a precise location. It was a general area where multiple positions might be firing simultaneously. The pattern suggested far more defenders than actually existed. One carbine firing tracers looked like 3 or 4 rifles firing ball ammunition. 10 carbines created the visual impression of a platoon-strength defensive position. The multiplication effect was geometric rather than arithmetic. What attackers felt, and this can be inferred from the behavioral changes documented in after-action reports, was confusion and disorientation. Training said charge into darkness. Training said muzzle flashes reveal enemy positions. Training said night attacks work because defenders can't see you coming. But their eyes said something else. Their eyes said you're running toward walls of fire that seem to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Their eyes said the darkness that should protect you is being stripped away by weapons that shouldn't be able to do that. Japanese military tradition, extending back centuries, placed enormous symbolic weight on fire from above. Artillery bombardment, naval gunfire, divine intervention in the form of kamikaze winds. Fire descending from the sky meant overwhelming force, meant the enemy possessed resources you couldn't match, meant defeat was likely. When infantry weapons produce similar visual effects, The psychological response could be expected to exceed the tactical reality. Fear doesn't require accurate threat assessment. Fear only requires the belief that continuing forward means certain death. And when that belief spreads through an assault formation faster than orders can counteract it, cohesion collapses. Men who were running full speed suddenly aren't. The banzai charge that should have overrun American positions fragments into isolated groups that defenders can engage piecemeal. One thing remains certain from the documentary evidence. Whatever terminology Japanese soldiers used to describe the phenomenon, they reacted to it in ways their doctrine hadn't prepared them for. And that reaction changed outcomes in measurable ways that American commanders noticed and exploited. Every tactical decision carries cost. Tracers reveal firing positions. This isn't theory. This isn't assumption. This is absolute physical reality that every soldier loading a tracer round understands. Every time you pull the trigger on a tracer-loaded carbine, you create a line of burning light pointing directly back to your foxhole, like an arrow drawn in fire. Japanese doctrine anticipated exactly this vulnerability. Forward observers trained specifically to mark tracer sources and call indirect fire. Snipers positioned themselves to exploit muzzle flash, waiting for defenders to give away their positions. The tactical trade-off seemed obvious. Tracers help you see where you're shooting, but guarantee the enemy sees where you're shooting from. Yet American commanders from battalion level up to division made a calculated choice starting in late 1943. They authorized tracer use for night defense despite the known risks. They accepted that defenders would expose their positions. They prioritized something else over concealment. The question military historians have examined extensively. Why? First answer: suppression matters more than concealment during mass attacks. When 300 Japanese soldiers charge a 200-yard defensive perimeter, revealing your position becomes irrelevant. They already know where you are. They're running directly at you. What matters isn't staying hidden. What matters is breaking their momentum before they close the final 50 yards and the fighting becomes hand-to-hand. Second answer: morale preservation among defenders. Soldiers who can see their fire connecting fight with greater confidence than soldiers firing blind into darkness. When you watch tracer rounds impact targets, when you see enemy formations reacting to your fire, when you can correct your aim based on visible trajectory, you believe you're effective. That belief matters more than most tactical manuals acknowledge. A defender who believes his weapon works will hold his position under pressure. A defender who doubts his effectiveness will break and run when the situation deteriorates. The M1 Carbine's reputation among Marines in 1942 was poor specifically because soldiers couldn't see results. They'd fire into darkness, hear screaming, but never know if they hit anything. Tracers solved that psychological problem. Third answer: coordination benefits that doctrine writers hadn't anticipated. When every third round glows white, adjacent defensive positions can identify where friendly fire is concentrating. They can shift their own sectors accordingly. They can prevent gaps in coverage that their infiltration teams exploit. The defensive line becomes self-coordinating without requiring radio communication that might be jammed or wire communication that might be cut. Field modifications emerged organically throughout 1944. Some units mounted early flashlights on carbines, crude devices powered by batteries that lasted maybe 20 minutes of continuous use. Others painted white stripes on carbine sights, using whatever material they could scavenge. Luminous watch paint worked if you could get it. Regular white paint worked almost as well once your eyes adjusted to darkness. The most significant adaptation: magazine marking systems. Soldiers began color-coding magazines with paint or tape. Red meant full tracer load. Green meant standard every third round mix. White meant ball ammunition only. This allowed rapid selection based on tactical situation without fumbling in darkness, trying to remember which magazine held which ammunition. Hoda. A defender could start an engagement with ball ammunition to avoid revealing his position. Switch to mixed tracers once the enemy located him anyway. Finish with full tracer loads if the situation became desperate enough that suppression mattered more than survival. By late 1944, training manuals explicitly acknowledged the trade-off. They stated clearly that tracer use revealed positions to enemy observers. They recommended it anyway for night defense. The psychological equation had been solved through battlefield experience rather than theoretical analysis. Fear generated exceeded vulnerability created. The visible fire streaming from defensive positions disrupted Japanese assault formations more effectively than the kinetic energy of the bullets themselves. An attack that broke apart before reaching American lines meant defenders never had to fight hand-to-hand. And avoiding hand-to-hand combat meant casualties stayed manageable. The mathematics written in burning phosphorus proved simpler than anyone expected. Light beats darkness. Visible threat beats invisible threat. Fear you can see is more powerful than fear you can only imagine. By mid-1944, patterns emerge in official after-action reports that tell a story beyond individual firefights. Saipan, June 15 through July 9, 1944. The island becomes the site of the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Over 4,300 Japanese troops attack on the night of July 7, crashing into defensive positions held by the 27th Infantry Division. The attack penetrates American lines in several locations. Hand-to-hand fighting lasts for hours. The casualty figures are brutal. Japanese forces lose approximately 4,000 killed in the assault. American casualties, nearly 1,000 dead and wounded. By any measure, the night represents one of the bloodiest close-quarters battles in Marine Corps history. But commanders filing reports in the weeks after notice something that wouldn't be obvious from casualty counts alone. Defensive positions using M1 Carbines loaded with tracers report that Japanese formations showed visible hesitation before contact. The official phrasing describes attacking forces as displaying reduced cohesion compared to similar mass assaults at Tarawa and Guadalcanal. The difference isn't subtle. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese banzai charges maintained formation discipline until physical contact with American positions. Casualties were inflicted, but momentum continued. At Saipan, formations began fragmenting 50 to 75 yards from American lines. The charge still arrived, men still died. But the coordinated mass assault that doctrine called for had already started breaking down before defenders fired their first shots. Intelligence officers attribute this partly to improved American defensive tactics learned through 2 years of Pacific combat. But interrogation reports suggest another factor. Prisoners describe American night positions as impossible to approach silently due to constant illumination. They describe defensive fire as coming from positions they couldn't locate precisely. They describe the psychological impossibility of charging toward visible walls of fire. Lady. October 20, 1944 through January 1945. The Philippines campaign produces different tactical patterns. Night infiltration attempts, previously a reliable Japanese tactic, decrease measurably after the first week of combat. Intelligence officers initially attribute this to Japanese casualties depleting experienced infantry units. But prisoners captured in late October tell a different story. American night positions have developed a reputation. Soldiers describe them as unnatural in interrogation transcripts, not because of casualties inflicted, because of the sensory impossibility of approaching them. One prisoner captured on October 28 describes attempting to infiltrate American lines 3 times over 5 nights. Each attempt ended in withdrawal when his team encountered tracer fire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The prisoner's description matches other accounts collected throughout the campaign. Defenders aren't just shooting, they're creating an environment where attack itself feels impossible. The psychological barrier exceeds the physical one. Okinawa, April through June 1945. The bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War produces documentation that fills entire warehouses. One consistent thread runs through the mountain of reports. M1 Carbine use has shifted completely from its 1942 role. The weapon no longer appears primarily in the hands of support personnel. Frontline infantry units request carbines specifically for night defense roles. Tracer loading is standard practice across divisions. Some units develop informal doctrine. Every rifleman carries 1 carbine magazine loaded entirely with tracers for emergency use during night attacks. The M1 Garand remains the primary infantry weapon for daytime operations. Its superior range and stopping power make it irreplaceable for most combat situations. But at night, the lighter carbine becomes preferred. The 15-round magazine allows sustained fire without reloading. The reduced recoil allows faster target transitions, and the tracer rounds create psychological effects that commanders have learned to exploit. The weapon hasn't changed since 1941. The ballistics remain identical. The .30 carbine cartridge still delivers 967 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. No more, no less. The engineering specifications Winchester submitted haven't been modified. But perception transformed everything. A weapon once doubted by frontline Marines becomes doctrinal equipment by 1945. Not because it became more lethal, not because engineers improved its design, because American forces learned to weaponize light itself. By war's end, over 6 million M1 carbines have been produced, more than any other United States small arm in World War II. More than the M1 Garand. More than the Thompson submachine gun. More than the Browning automatic rifle. A weapon designed for clerks and radiomen becomes the most prolific infantry weapon in the American arsenal. The transformation didn't happen in laboratories. It happened in foxholes. It happened during night defense on Guadalcanal when Marines discovered that visible fire disrupted Japanese attacks more effectively than accurate fire. It happened through adaptation rather than design. And it proved something that military theorists would debate for decades afterward. Fear matters more than kinetic energy. Psychological effects matter more than ballistic performance. A weapon that makes the enemy hesitate is worth more than a weapon that kills efficiently. 60 years after the last shot fired on Okinawa, military historians still argue about the M1 Carbine's true effectiveness. Korean War reports revive every criticism from 1942. Soldiers complain about stopping power in sub-zero temperatures where heavy winter clothing absorbs lighter bullets. The weapon performs poorly in sustained combat at ranges exceeding 100 yards. The .30 carbine cartridge proves inadequate against enemy soldiers wearing padded winter uniforms. Complaints echo through official channels until units begin requesting M1 Garands or the newer M14 rifle. Vietnam repeats the pattern. By 1968, most M1 carbines have been replaced by M16 rifles, chambered in 5.5, 6x4, 5M. The intermediate cartridge era has arrived. The .30 carbine, too weak for rifle applications, too powerful for submachine gun roles, becomes a technological dead end. The weapon that dominated Pacific night fighting in 1944 becomes obsolete by 1970. But tactical lessons endure longer than hardware. Perception shapes battlefield behavior more than ballistic tables ever will. Japanese soldiers didn't fear the .30 carbine cartridge because of its muzzle energy or penetration characteristics. They feared what it represented: weapons that transformed night from tactical advantage into killing ground. Weapons that made invisible threats visible. Weapons that created psychological effects exceeding their physical capabilities. Whether Japanese veterans specifically used the phrase skyfire remains historically uncertain. English-language archives contain no verified instances of that exact terminology in translated interrogation transcripts or post-war interviews, but the phenomenon those words might have described was unquestionably real and extensively documented. American after-action reports from Bougainville to Okinawa consistently note that Japanese forces reacted to tracer fire with behavioral changes their doctrine hadn't prepared them for. Attacks faltered, formations lost cohesion, soldiers who should have pressed forward withdrew instead. The pattern repeats too consistently across too many battles to be coincidence. What Japanese soldiers remembered, in whatever language they used, wasn't technical specifications, it was sensory experience. The feeling of running full speed towards streaks of burning white that multiplied with every step. The cognitive dissonance of training that said night attacks work confronting eyes that said you're charging toward walls of fire. The impossibility of locating shooters when fire seemed to originate from everywhere simultaneously. This principle echoes through modern warfare in ways that would surprise soldiers who fought with M1 carbines on Guadalcanal. Night vision equipment that turns darkness into green-tinted daylight creates the same psychological effect. Laser designators that paint targets with invisible infrared beams, visible only through specialized optics, create the same one-sided visibility advantage. Thermal imaging that reveals body heat through vegetation creates the same sense that nowhere is safe. Nothing provides concealment. Each technology weaponizes a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Each creates psychological effects disproportionate to kinetic damage. Each proves that making threats visible matters more than making threats lethal. The myth about aircraft ammunition persists because myths form around sensory truth rather than technical accuracy. There were no aircraft rounds loaded into M1 carbines. That claim is mechanically impossible and easily disproven. But there was fire streaking through jungle darkness in patterns that violated Japanese expectations. There were attacks breaking apart under illumination that shouldn't have existed. There were soldiers on both sides who witnessed something that changed how they understood combat. The story matters not because it's exotic or mysterious. The story matters because it demonstrates something fundamental about warfare that technology hasn't changed. Humans respond to what they can see more strongly than what they can only imagine. Fear of visible threats exceeds fear of invisible ones. Psychological dominance can be more valuable than material superiority. A weapon designed for clerks became feared by combat veterans, not because it killed more efficiently, not because it achieved better ballistic performance, because it made fear visible in darkness, because it transformed the enemy's tactical advantage into liability, because it proved that light itself could be weaponized just as effectively as kinetic energy. 6 million carbines produced, millions of rounds of tracer ammunition expended, thousands of night defense engagements where visible fire disrupted Japanese attacks. The numbers tell a story of adaptation, succeeding where design intent failed, of soldiers in foxholes solving tactical problems that engineers in laboratories never anticipated, of perception mattering more than physics. The M1 Carbine became obsolete. The tactics developed around it evolved into modern night fighting doctrine. But the lesson endures. Never underestimate how powerfully human beings respond to things they can see versus things they can only fear. Never assume that lethality matters more than psychology. Never forget that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that kills best. It's the one that makes the enemy stop fighting. If this story of adaptation and battlefield innovation moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next untold report. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be the inspiration someone else needs to hear today. Weighed less than 6 pounds and fired rounds